Welcome to The Hollow Between, a podcast of folklore, ghost stories, and the uncanny. I'm Candace, and tonight, beside the lantern light, I have a story for you. Tonight, we step into the strange, bright darkness of midsummer. I know that may sound like a contradiction. Bright darkness. But if you have ever stood outside on a summer evening when the sun has finally slipped below the trees, you know exactly what I mean. There's a kind of light that lingers. Not daylight exactly, and not night either, but a suspended hour. The sky still faintly blue, the grass cooling beneath your feet, the trees turning black at their edges, the air warm enough to feel alive against your skin. And somewhere in that hour, something in the world feels loosened, as if the door between what is ordinary and what is not has been left slightly ajar. Midsummer has always belonged to that door, to thresholds and bonfires, flowers, to lovers and omens, to holy wells, hilltops, fairies, herbs, and strange lights seen moving where no light should be. And although we often think of ghost stories as belonging to autumn or winter, there's something deeply uncanny about summer. The long days, the short nights, the green abundance pressing close. The feeling that everything is growing too quickly, blooming too fully, and whispering too loudly in the dark. Yes, winter has its ghosts, but summer, it has its enchantments. And enchantments, as folklore often reminds us, are not always safe. Across many parts of Europe, midsummer was marked by fire. Great fires, communal fires, bonfires built on hillsides, at crossroads, near fields, or at the edges of villages. They were lit at a turning point in the year, near the summer solstice, when the sun had climbed to its greatest strength, and yet, from that moment forward, would begin its slow descent into darkness again. That's one of the strange beauties of midsummer. It's a celebration of light at the very moment the light begins to retreat. And maybe that's why people lit fires, not only to honor the sun, but to hold it, to carry a piece of it into the night. In some traditions, people danced around the fires. In others, they leapt across the flames for luck, protection, fertility, health, or love. There were places where cattle were driven near the smoke or through the ashes as a kind of blessing for the season to come. Ashes might be carried back to fields and embers brought home. The remains of fires scattered over crops or tucked into the life of the household, as if the flame itself could guard what was precious. And in some villages, people believed the fires did more than celebrate the turning year. They believed the flames kept certain wandering things from crossing too close to the fields before dawn. Not evil things necessarily. That's rarely how old folklore describes them. Simply other things. Things better left beyond the hedgerows. And of course, over time, many older seasonal customs became attached to the Christian feast of St. John the Baptist. Midsummer became St. John's Eve in many places. But beneath the church bells and feast days, older rhythms remained. Fire, water, flowers, divination. The belief that certain nights are not like other nights. The belief that the world opens only a little, but just enough. Midsummer was not only a season of fire, but it was also a season of plants. And this is one of my favorite pieces of midsummer folklore. The old belief that certain herbs gathered at midsummer were especially potent, as if the sun, at the height of its power, had filled them with a little extra something. St. John's wort, mugwort, vervain, yarrow, foxglove, elderflower, the list goes on, appear again and again in folk traditions, charms, remedies, and protective customs. Some were hung over doors, placed beneath pillows, gathered at dawn, and some were never to be gathered without care. Many were connected not simply to healing, but to protection from storms, from illness, from witchcraft, from spirits, or from whatever might come too near the house. Because midsummer, for all its flowers and warmth, has never been entirely innocent. It is a beautiful season, but beauty in folklore is rarely harmless. The hedge in bloom may be lovely, the field may be golden, the woods may smell of green leaves and sweet damp earth, but the path through them still disappears after dark. And in older stories, summer nights were full of presences. There were fair folk, wandering spirits, unseen watchers, figures glimpsed between the trees. There were lights over marshland, voices calling from places where no person stood. Midsummer was a time of revelry, but it was also a time to be cautious, to watch where you stepped, to know which plants protected you, to be careful for what you wished for, and perhaps most importantly, to be wary of following lights into the dark. We often speak of the veil growing thin at Halloween, at Samhain, at All Hallows, and certainly autumn has its own haunted authority. But folklore does not reserve thin places for just one season alone. There are many thresholds in a year. The first frost, the last harvest, the longest night, the first bloom. That moment when winter gives way to spring, and midsummer. Midsummer is one of the strangest because it does not feel like death. It feels like life, but too much life. The vines climb, the insects sing, flowers open, the fields grow tall enough to hide what moves inside them. The woods become deep and green and secretive. It's a season of abundance, and yet abundance can be unsettling. Too many leaves, too much light, too many sounds after dark. Perhaps that's why midsummer stories so often belong to enchantment. Not the clean, pretty kind, but the older kind. The kind that leads you away from the path. The kind that asks for a promise. The kind that leaves you changed. And tonight's story belongs to that older kind of summer. A story of firelight, a vanished girl, and a path through the hedgerows that no one in the village could ever find twice. So sit back, relax, and let me take you into the story of the girl who followed the midsummer light. There was once a village tucked between two low hills, bordered on one side by a dark wood, and on the other by fields that turned gold every June. No one remembered who had planted the hedgerows. They were older than the oldest houses, older than the church, older, some say, than the road itself. They wound through the fields in crooked lines of hawthorn, blackthorn, elder, and briar, blooming white in spring and darkening into dense green walls by summer. Children were told never to crawl through them after sunset. Not because of thorns, though those were plenty, but because the hedgerows did not always lead back to the same place after dark. Most children heard this warning and forgot it. All warnings become ordinary when repeated enough. One girl remembered. Her name was Elspeth Vale. She was 17 years old, with a quiet face and a habit of listening more than she spoke. She lived with her mother in a cottage at the end of the village, where the lane narrowed and the hedgerows grew especially high. Her father had died when she was young. A fever, people said, though her mother rarely spoke of it. The only thing Elspeth had of his was a small brass button from his coat that she kept in a box beside her bed. Every midsummer, the village lit a great bonfire in the upper field. Everyone came. The old, the young, the newly married, the lonely, the practical, and the foolish. They brought bread and cider. They carried bundles of herbs. They sang songs no one could quite remember learning. And when the fire was high enough, the brave and the lovesick leapt across the smaller flames at its edges, laughing as the sparks flew upward into the darkening sky. Elspeth had never jumped the fire. She said she didn't care for such things, but every year she watched. And every year, just before the fire was lit, her mother took her by the wrist and whispered the same thing: "Stay where you can see the flame." Elspeth never asked why. Not until the summer she turned 17. That year, the evening was unusually warm. The kind of warm that makes the air feel heavy, as if rain is thinking about falling but has not yet decided. The hedgerows smelled of crushed leaves and blossoms. Swallows darted low over the fields. And the sun went down slowly, reluctantly, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised peach. At dusk, the villagers gathered around the unlit bonfire. Children ran in circles with their hands sticky from honey cakes. And Elspeth stood near her mother, watching the men strike flint and coax the first flame of the bonfire into being. The fire caught slowly at first. Just a curl of smoke, a lick of orange, then suddenly with a soft roar it climbed upward. The crowd cheered. Sparks rose into the evening, and just for a moment, everything beyond the circle of firelight vanished. The hills, the trees, the hedgerows, all gone. There was only warmth, only faces and the flame. But then Elspeth saw the light. It appeared beyond the far hedge, just past the edge of the field. It was small, amber, steady. At first she thought it was a lantern carried by someone late to the gathering. But it did not bob the way a lantern should. It hovered, perfectly still. Then it moved, not toward the bonfire, but away from it, down the old footpath that led between the hedgerows and into the lower meadow. Elspeth looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but no one had. Her mother was speaking with a neighbor. The fiddler had begun to play. Young men were daring one another closer to the flames. And that little amber light paused at the opening in the hedge. Then slowly, it passed through. And though Elspeth could not have explained why, she suddenly had the terrible feeling that the light had been waiting specifically for her, not watching the crowd, not drifting aimlessly, but waiting. Elspeth felt something inside her answer. Not curiosity exactly, recognition, as if the light had called her by a name she had not heard since childhood. She stepped away from the fire, only a few paces, then a few more. The music behind her softened, the laughter dimmed, the warmth fell away from her back. At the gap in the hedge, she paused. Branches arched overhead, dark and tangled. The path beyond was narrow, but the light floated ahead, waiting. It was too high, too close. Flowers brushed against Elspeth's sleeves, though she could not remember seeing blossoms there earlier that evening. Some of them seemed to turn toward the amber light as it passed, not toward the moon, but toward the light. Elspeth reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around the small brass button. She had brought it with her that evening without even knowing why. Behind her, the bonfire crackled. Then her mother's voice cut sharply through the music. "Elspeth!" She turned. Her mother stood in the firelight, pale and very still. "Do not follow it," she said. The villagers nearest them went quiet. Someone laughed uneasily. but Elspeth looked back toward the path. The ember light had moved farther away, almost out of sight now, and from somewhere beyond the hedge, she heard a man's voice. It was soft and familiar. Elsie. But there was something strange about that voice. Not wrong exactly, distant, as though she were hearing her father's voice remembered through water. No one had called her that since her father died. Her mother began walking toward her. "Elspeth, come away." But the voice came again. "Elsie." And this time it sounded so full of tenderness that Elspeth stepped through the hedge before she could stop herself. The branches closed behind her, and at once the bonfire disappeared from her sight. So did the music and the village. There was only the narrow path, the smell of leaves, and the amber light drifting ahead. Elspeth followed. The path twisted through the hedgerows in ways she didn't recognize. Left, then right, then down a slope where no slope had ever been. The grass grew taller there, and the air was much cooler. Somewhere nearby, water moved over stones, though there was no stream in that field. And all around her, the hedgerows whispered, not with wind, but with voices almost too quiet to hear. Now and then Elspeth thought she heard laughter woven among them, or singing. Thin, beautiful singing that rose and fell like summer insects in tall grass. She couldn't understand the words, but against all reason, part of her wanted desperately to follow the sound deeper into the dark. Elspeth called out, "Father?" The light paused for a moment. She saw a figure standing beside it. Tall, thin. It looked to be a man in a dark coat. His face was turned away from her. Elspeth couldn't breathe. She took the brass button from her pocket and held it tightly in her palm. "Father," she said again. The figure lifted one hand, not beckoning, but in warning. Then the hedgerow behind her began to whisper. It was voices, many voices, low and overlapping. Some were weeping, some were laughing, some were calling names. Names Elspeth didn't know, names somehow she felt she had always known. The amber light flickered, and for the first time, it seemed uncertain, almost nervous, as though something in the hedgerows had drawn too near even for it. And then the figure spoke, not in the voice that had called her, not in her father's voice at all. "Run," it said. Elspeth ran. Branches clawed at her skirt and thorns caught her sleeves. The path twisted beneath her feet. Behind her, the voices rose from whispers into something almost like wailing, yet it was sweet and terrible at the same time. Ahead, through the dark green tunnel, Elspeth saw firelight, very faint and very far. She ran toward it. When she burst back through the hedge, the bonfire had burned low. The villagers were searching in the field with lanterns. Her mother saw her first. She cried out and ran to her, gathering her in her arms. Elspeth was cold to the touch. Her dress was torn and her hair was full of leaves. And though she believed she had only been gone minutes, 3 hours had passed. No one spoke much of what happened after that. The old women took one look at the scratches on Elspeth's arms and crossed themselves. The men searched the lower meadow and found no strange gate, no path, no stream, no footprints but Elspeth's own, leading to the hedge and back again. But in the morning, Elspeth's mother told her the truth. The summer Elspeth's father had died. He hadn't died in bed from fever as she was told. He had followed a light on Midsummer's night, just as she had. The villagers found him at dawn near the hedgerow, alive but emptied somehow. He never fully woke from whatever he had seen, and by autumn, he was gone. Elspeth listened without speaking. She reached into her apron pocket for the brass button, but it was no longer there. In its place lay a small white flower. No one in the village knew what kind it was. It didn't wilt, not that day, not the next, not even years later when Elspeth herself became an old woman who sat by the fire and warned children not to wander past the hedgerows after dark. She never claimed to understand what had happened. She never claimed the light was evil, though that was the most troubling part. When asked what she felt upon seeing it, she would only say, "It was beautiful." Then, after a moment, she would add, "And beauty has teeth." To this day, so the story goes, there are certain fields where the hedgerows grow too thick in June, certain paths that seem unfamiliar after sunset, certain amber lights seen drifting low between the branches on midsummer night. And there are old stories still told quietly in some villages of people who wandered briefly from midsummer gatherings and returned hours later unable to explain where they had been. Not harmed, only changed somehow. Quiet, distracted, as though part of them were still listening for music in the hedgerows. And if you should ever find yourself standing at the edge of such a path, with music and firelight behind you and something lovely calling from ahead, remember Elspeth Vale and remember the bonfire, and always stay where you can see the flame. There's something about midsummer that feels too full for the world to hold. Too much green, too much light, too much warmth gathered in the stones and fields. And perhaps that's why the old stories place danger there. Not in barrenness, not in silence, but in abundance, in beauty, in the flowering hedge, in that golden field, in the light that seems, at first, to mean no harm. Midsummer reminds us that thresholds are not always dark. Some are bright and smell of blossoms. Some are lined with fire and music and laughter, and still they lead elsewhere. So, this season, when evenings stretch long and the trees grow black against a blue summer sky, perhaps you might notice the old magic of the turning year, the lanterns glowing on porches, the flowers opening in the dusk, the paths half hidden by green leaves, the strange hush that falls just after sunset. And if you light a candle or sit beside a fire or watch the last flicker over the grass, perhaps remember the old midsummer custom. Keep close to the flame, not because the dark is empty, but because sometimes it's not. Please send your stories to thehollowbetween@gmail.com. Perhaps your story might be shared here beside the lantern light. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me, and until next time, mind the hollow between.